Well, here we are. Mass Effect 3, finally finishing something that I began a fair amount of time ago when I properly started to take this whole reviewing games thing as seriously as I can. Assuming that I've done this properly, this will be uploaded a year since the first entry in this review series, down to the day. Bit late to end it, but that's circumstances of the time for ya. But before I begin, full transparency, I have played and beaten both Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2, both with and without DLC, as well as their Legendary Edition iterations for their respective reviews. Mass Effect 3 is the only game in this trilogy that I haven't played and consequently beaten with DLC. To be more specific, I played the Xbox 360 version of the title on a console that at the time didn't have access to the internet at all, so more than just without DLC, it was similarly wholly unpatched. I've seen the original, non-extended ending. I have thoughts, but later when I get there. Mass Effect 3 originally released in the year to end all years, 2012, and was like its predecessors before it, developed by BioWare and produced by EA. It originally had a less than stellar release, which wasn't due to any kind of game-breaking bugs or a major lack of content, sort of. It was more due to fan perception of specific aspects of that content. Also, the whole Day 1 DLC thing was kind of a slap to the face of fans everywhere. I'll get back to both of those in a bit, but for now just know that EA was named the worst company in America the same year as Mass Effect 3's release, as according to polling done by Consumerist. As with the previous two titles, you play as Commander Shepard, and the Reapers have at long last arrived, and their so-called harvest has arrived with them. As predicted, their overwhelming force is effectively squashing all opposition, and so you and your allies must pin all of your hopes of beating this extinction-level threat upon a mysterious Prothean technology called the Crucible. What is the Crucible, you might ask? Good question. No one really knows. They just know that the Protheans also likely pinned all their hopes on this device but were killed off before its completion, which obviously bodes well for you. Along the way of completing the Crucible, you'll come across old friends and enemies, and you'll find yourself making choices that can affect the entire galaxy, whose potential repercussions could last far into the future, from the mostly mundane to other options that are not that. Most, if not all of these choices, build up your military strength, likely the most important factor that decides on what ending you get. More specifically, it determines which and how many endings you have available to choose from at the ending, with some variations therein based on other choices. The Legendary Edition has the exact numbers for your military strength change due to the changes between the original and the Legendary Edition version of Mass Effect 3, which makes sense. The majority of the characters you come across are great, honestly, both those returning and those new to the fold, but there are some things that I should note. Spoilers for, well, the whole trilogy, really. If you don't want that, head here. So some of your choices, I've noticed, and I'm sure I'm not alone here, don't matter nearly as much as you might initially believe. At least some of them, anyway. I know that's potentially blasphemous, but I say this with good reason. Some of these choices, like helping Tali's pilgrimage from the first Mass Effect, are largely inconsequential, in that you don't see the direct effects of said choice. This kind of choice isn't what I'm talking about. Likewise, the trilogy's seeming attempts to guilt you about choices you actually couldn't make, the 2 emails from Tombs and the freed convict that I talked about in my Mass Effect 2 review, aren't what I'm talking about either. I mean something like this. At the end of the first Mass Effect, you can choose to save or not to save the Destiny Ascension in the battle against Sovereign. This determines whether or not the Council lives through the fight. These counselors have certain feelings about various aspects of the galaxy, which you might expect, but let's say you don't protect the Destiny Ascension. The Council is instead destroyed, and now there's a human-led Council as a direct result. That doesn't matter. By the third game, the Council is no longer human-led regardless of other choices, and these new counselors do largely the same thing that the original ones would have done in their place. Also, in an annoying move, regardless of who you chose as the counselor in the first game, Odina's the counselor now. The justification for this depends based on a few factors, but regardless, that's his role now, despite whatever choice you made in the past. You can choose to save or condemn the Rachni in Mass Effect, but the Reapers have their own Rachni forces, though called Ravagers here, to achieve the same effect if you didn't, mechanically if nothing else. You can choose to reprogram or kill Legion's enemies, the so-called heretic Geth in Mass Effect 2, but the Geth still return to wage war on the Quarians alongside Reapers. This makes no sense given what Legion explains about Geth society and their general viewpoint on those heretics, but hey, I guess a threat was needed. This isn't to say that there aren't important and impactful choices around some specific details involved in those choices or lack thereof, except for maybe the counselor thing. That doesn't have, like, any impact. Udina being counselor now only really seems important given some of his actions later in the story, most specifically his betrayal on the Citadel. I can't see Anderson doing that anyway. The Rek'Nai Queen can be rescued a second time, which results in war assets. And the Geth-Quarian conflict has some really interesting choices around it that require other choices to have been made in the past, but it still feels like that initial premise, you know, the conflict itself, and some key aspects of it, specifically how the Reapers are involved and their interactions with the Geth, could have been handled much better. Thankfully, not all choices are like this. Pretty much the entirety of what occurs in Tachanka is great, and as much as I harped on the basic setup for Rannoch's events, I couldn't help but feel something at its end. Having said that, we should probably talk about the endings, most specifically how these endings are presented and how they interact with previous choices in the game and series as a whole. Though to be fair, given that this is the Legendary Edition, a fair amount of issues that I originally had have been somewhat placated. I still want to talk about them though, if only because it would feel like I'm lying by omission if I didn't. So for context, in Mass Effect, the story was fairly self-contained. Plenty of choices that could carry forward into its sequels, but choices that could either directly or indirectly affect the ending itself were exceedingly rare. Mass Effect 2 likewise had plenty of choices with ramifications further on in the story, and unlike its predecessor, had choices that directly impacted how the suicide mission at the end of the game could go, some of which you might not even initially realize could affect the ending. Mass Effect 3, at least as it was originally released, fell firmly into the same territory as the first Mass Effect. A fair amount of choices that built upon past choices, but once you reached those final moments, you realize that all it did was get you to the ending. Mass Effect 3 needed to resolve dozens of story threads, and initially it solved this problem by giving you one of 3 overarching choices, wherein all other choices you made up to that point didn't really matter. Now there is the extended cut, but that feels like it was something that was always meant to be there in the first place. I mean, what's the point of making choices with galaxy-spanning consequences if you don't get to see the consequences? Obviously, I didn't like the original ending, and while the extended cut is nice adding to it, the original ending, choice and consequence all leading to an incredibly disappointing ending that I won't forget. It's left a bitter taste in my mouth, and no amount of updates to that ending would change my feelings about it. The fact that it's my, as well as many others' first experience with the title doesn't help. It's a shame, too. I really liked everything that was leading up to the ending. That actually explains fairly well how I feel about Mass Effect 3's story. I really enjoyed it, but its ending, specifically in how it plays out, before the extended cut's actual content, left me with a bitter taste and largely disappointed. Not to mention a whole slew of questions about the ending that I have neither the heart nor motivation to get into. For those just returning from skipping spoilers, I'll give you the basic rundown. I like Mass Effect 3's story, but certain elements, especially towards the end, left me wanting more than anything else. Something else that left me wanting: why was Javik Day 1 DLC? Why was a Prothean hidden behind a paywall? For a friendly reminder, the Protheans were the reigning species from the previous cycle whose technology you are actively using to combat the Reapers. The Protheans are so intrinsic towards this trilogy and Mass Effect lore as a whole that the Beacon, which kickstarted this entire saga, you know, the one that originally showed Shepard the Reapers and warned them against the mechanical threat that the Reapers are, that was Prothean. Such an important thing, such an important character hidden behind DLC. Day 1 DLC at that, which suggests, first, not only was this finished before launch and thus entirely capable of being in the base game, either on disc or in a patch if some sources are to be believed, but second, they created and shipped it knowing full well that this character's potential impact on the game, and more specifically on the lore surrounding the series, would be so important that people would pay for it regardless of this undeniably greedy tactic. Whether or not he would, or for that matter could, have an actual impact on the mainline story is besides the point. This is just garbage. I know that technically this is a review of the Legendary Edition, so that Day 1 DLC price isn't here anymore, but it's also an important thing to note that it happened and ultimately it wasn't okay. The other major DLCs though, those being the Omega, Citadel, and Leviathan DLCs, are really cool. It shouldn't be a surprise that Leviathan is my favorite, especially with that beginning that reminds me of my favorite mission from the first game, and the Citadel DLC, while being honestly kinda dumb, is still pretty fun. I've got other non-monetary issues though. For whatever reason I wasn't unlocking achievements. The last one I have unlocked was for the Shadow Broker DLC from Mass Effect 2. Nothing after that for that game, and nothing from this game at all. I'm not generally one to care about achievements. I don't really find them interesting beyond occasionally revealing some interesting details or actions capable in the game that I might not have known about originally, but I still find it weird that I could get achievements until that point. Dialogue can just kinda peter out out at times, likewise unsure of the cause. The lens flares and depth of field effects can be annoying and assumably not the game's fault. Trying to record using GeForce Experience was a pain in the ass occasionally. There are also 2 crashes occurred when there was a lot of stuff on screen, so at least I can say, oh, this was the cause, but it's still frustrating because I have a 3090 now. The companions are cool, except for 2. James Vega, I just didn't really find that interesting, and the other, I guess technically isn't a companion relative to how Vega is Allers? Diana Allers, why are you here? Why aren't you Emily Wong, who Shepard already has a history with, or Al Jelani, who Shepard also already has a history with? Oh, also cool to see Conrad Werner back once more, and I've got mixed feelings about him. On the one hand, not fixing the bug with his interaction in Mass Effect 2 and instead applying an I was really stressed out band-aid in Mass Effect 3 seems a bit lazy, but on the other hand, I respect the somewhat clever subversion of using it as something of a character trait, though I'll grant that the fact it could be used that way seems more incidental than intentional. Moving on. The gameplay still follows the RPG-light FPS loop of leveling up abilities and using them in combat alongside your firearms. We're once again back to being able to use all of the weapons available in the game. That's nice, although heavy weapons are now limited use and found in the environments. And there's an interesting trade-off here, wherein the weaponry you bring on a mission has a specific weight. This affects cooldown speeds, and itself can be affected by modifying your gear, whose modifications can also affect other factors like damage and accuracy. There's also more options involved in leveling outside of just statistical progression, you know, increasing or decreasing numbers. As you level up a skill, you get 2 paths that you can choose from that offer different benefits. Admittedly, this is still mostly statistical progression, but sometimes it isn't, which is more than no times. Taking cover is still super important, but now you can dodge roll, melee attacks feel much more viable outside of specific enemy types, and Shepard can actually sprint for more than the 3 seconds that they could before. At last, this professionally trained Lieutenant Commander, canonical hero and badass of the Systems Alliance, and first ever human Spectre handpicked by the Citadel Council to deal with a potentially galaxy-spanning threat can outrun me, a 26-year-old idiot who's currently on the internet making fun of a made-up person who doesn't exist. Good for you, Shepard. Nothing really complicates this to an extreme degree, but the gameplay itself was never the selling point for these games, let's be honest. The environments are cool, and once more I get to hear my favorite galaxy map music some more. The music's overall good, surprising no one, and here's some of it now.
Don't know if you can hear me, but since you can't tell me to get the hell out either, I'm gonna take my chances.
The best part was, we didn't really need the intel in the end.
I never thought our empire would fall. It won't.
Can't see much from here. Suit is holding up. Emergency systems have come online. Life support operational.
So, story, fairly great, though there are some details I wish were dealt with differently, and conversational animations are still used and reused fairly often. The gameplay, while simplistic, is solid, and adding in some branching paths within the leveling system is a nice touch that both harkens back to the series' roots and further exemplifies the player choice aspect of the title. Environments and music are great as well and help carry you forward through the game. It's a solid standing within the trilogy, and while it's within the Legendary Edition, it has every bit of DLC and the extended cut. Also, the first and second games too, but I've talked about them before. Not my favorite in the series, especially considering my initial interactions with it, but still a good time, for the most part. Question now is, will I do Andromeda? Maybe. Probably not immediately, but maybe. Feel free to do all those things YouTube wants me to bother you about if you want to see more potentially good reviews on whatever strikes my fancy. You know, like, comment, subscribe, that whole song and dance. I've also got a Twitter and a Twitch, neither of which I interact much with, but they are there, they do exist. I'll see you later. Story out.